Joining me in the now is Kenneth Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. Mr. Roth, thank you so much for finding time to be with us. The latest sentiment seems to be it's the rebels.
Thanks for having me.
It's the rebels who are bombing, who Russia is bombing, rather, not ISIS terrorists. And you particularly seem to be convinced that that's the case. Tell us why.
Well, obviously, Russia's bombing a bit of each, but it's justifying this intervention by going after the Islamic State or ISIS. And, you know, by all means, they're horrible. But in fact, if you look at whom Russia is actually bombing, it's mostly the other rebels. And so there's an issue of honesty there. But frankly, there's also a concern because, you know, Russia shouldn't be sending the message that the safest place to be in opposition-held territory is ISIS territory. That would be utterly counterproductive.
Where is the information coming from that ISIS are not the main targets here, that it's other opposition that's being targeted?
Well, if you simply, you know, chart on a map where the Russian bombs are falling, you know, we know very well the areas held by ISIS and the areas held by other members of the armed opposition. And so it's pretty straightforward. Now, you know, occasionally Russia is bombing ISIS areas. I don't want to pretend that that never happens. But certainly the preponderance of the efforts so far have been aimed at other members of the armed opposition, you know, frankly, the ones that pose a more immediate threat to the Assad government. Because, you know, one thing we've seen over the last couple of years is that there's relatively little fighting between Assad and ISIS. Assad is much more concerned with the other members of the armed opposition. And so, you know, by all means, Russia can be propping up the Assad dictatorship. But a real concern we have is that Assad is fighting this war in an incredibly ugly way, targeting civilians in opposition-held areas. And I would hope that particularly as Russia gets more involved in this war, that it will stop the barrel bombing of civilians, that it will stop Assad's deliberate efforts to target civilians and to fire indiscriminately into civilian territories and neighborhoods.
If propping up Assad, like you say, was a priority for Russia and not fighting ISIS, why would they wait so long to start these strikes, wait for ISIS to make the gains that it has over the last year and a half or so?
Well, I mean, I think you'll have to ask Moscow that question. But, I mean, clearly Assad signaled in a speech a few weeks ago that he's in trouble. You know, he's having real manpower shortages in his army. The opposition is gaining, and it's not simply ISIS, which you know, is certainly making strides forward, but it's been mainly the other elements of the armed opposition that took Idlib province, for example, which was a big loss for the regime, which has been closing in around Damascus from the suburbs. And I think that, you know, frankly, the Russian government just panicked and recognized that their ally was in trouble, so they went to his support. And you know, that's certainly Russia's prerogative, but the issue really is don't prop up the war crimes that the Assad government is committing. Don't prop up its deliberate targeting of civilians. Because, in fact, that targeting of civilians is utterly counterproductive for the Assad regime's survival. It is the best recruiting tool that ISIS has. They can simply show the barrel bomb destruction in civilian neighborhoods, and people flock to ISIS or to other elements of the opposition. So I would hope that Russia, in its own interest, in the Assad government's interest, not to mention in the interest of the Syrian civilian people, that it would stop these attacks on the civilian population.
Speaking of attacks that you say on the civilian population, the Kunduz attack, which you, of course, condemned, in Twitter you mentioned that it was awful, but also in the same tweet pointed out that Assad attacks hospitals deliberately all the time. You've been speaking about targeting civilians. Why would Assad target civilians? Where's the logic here when the whole world is watching every step?
Yeah. You know, it's an incredibly ugly war crime strategy, but it has epitomized the Assad government's approach to this war from nearly the outset. And I think his strategy is twofold. First, to try to depopulate the areas that the armed opposition has taken. So just to make it harder for the opposition to operate there. So they clearly want to kill enough civilians so the others flee. They also, frankly, want to send a message to other Syrian civilians. This is what will happen to you if the armed opposition takes your neighborhood. We will decimate your neighborhood. We will drop barrel bombs on it. That is, you know, a blatant violation of the Geneva Conventions, a clear war crime, but that's the way the Assad government has been fighting this war. Now, Russia, you know, to its credit, did join in a UN Security Council resolution in February 2014 condemning these barrel bomb attacks on the civilian population, but it has done nothing to enforce that resolution. So I hope that now that Russia is much more engaged in Syria, now that its military is deployed there, that it will use its enormous influence with this Assad government. It'll use its influence as, frankly, the savior of that government to insist that Assad stop targeting Syrian civilians.
Mr. Roth, essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that Assad's strategy is to warn civilian areas that they will be bombed if they're kind of taken over by any kind of these rebels. So essentially warning them to get out. This is what you're saying. But some of
worse than warming. It's worse than warming. That he bombs them.
Where is the evidence? Because there's so many sides to this story. What kind of facts can we rely on saying that Assad is directly bombing, like you say, hospitals?
Oh, I mean, this is completely irrefutable. Human Rights Watch has issued numerous reports based on on-site investigations. Physicians for Human Rights is actually, if you go to its website, it is documented, case after case after case of hospitals being attacked. I personally have spoken with many Syrian doctors who describe the helicopters circling overhead and dropping the barrel bomb, not just once, but repeatedly on the hospitals. It's gotten to the point where in opposition areas, there actually aren't even any more above ground hospitals left. It's too dangerous. The hospitals have now had to go underground, but even then, the Assad government figures out where they are and drops barrel bombs on them. So, there is zero question that this has been the strategy. Russia can close its eyes to it, but let's recognize what's going on here. The Syrian people know this, and so far as they see Assad deliberately attacking civilians, they are going to flock to the opposition. So if Russia really wants to save the Syrian government, it should rein in its attacks on the civilian population, because that is the best recruitment tool the opposition has.
You have a very clear political position. You're very active on social media. The world, I think it's fair to say, knows what you think of President Assad and of President Putin. You don't hesitate to express it. How does that not influence the investigations of people that work for you, investigations of Human Rights Watch on the ground in Syria, like you say?
I don't have any political position. We never take positions on who should win an election, who's a good guy or bad guy in a political debate. Our focus is simply on sparing civilians in time of war. Our only politics are to uphold the Geneva Conventions. And so the instructions I give to the Human Rights Watch staff, which they are required to follow scrupulously, is that they call the facts as they are. Good facts, bad facts, it doesn't matter. I want to know what happened. We then assess that under the Geneva Conventions. And sadly, what we have seen is that the Assad government has ripped up the Geneva Conventions. It has flouted it in the most basic ways by making not only no efforts to spare civilians, but rather by indiscriminately bombing civilian neighborhoods and targeting civilians who happen to live in areas held by the armed opposition.
You're telling me that people that work for you or investigations that cooperate and coordinate with Human Rights Watch don't listen to your constant expressions of Assad being a dictator, of Russia doing the wrong thing. I mean, this has to affect, someone needs to be listening to your position. Maybe not on who should win an election, but they certainly know your point of view on Assad. Mm-hmm.
Look, I'm very critical of ISIS. If you look at my tweets, I'm constantly criticizing ISIS. We criticize other members of the armed opposition. If you look at Russia's behavior, I was in Ukraine recently. We criticize Ukrainian government abuses. We also criticize abuses by the Russian-backed rebels. We are scrupulously fair in any armed conflict. We look at both sides, we record the facts as they are, and we apply those facts under international humanitarian law or the Geneva Conventions. And in this case, there is zero question about this. ISIS is flouting the most basic norms of international law by beheading civilians and the like, by imposing its very rigid view of Islam on the people who happen to live under ISIS. There have been other abuses by rebels, which Human Rights Watch has reported on. But if you want to say what is the biggest killer of civilians today, sadly, no one holds a candle to Assad. He is responsible for the vast majority of civilian deaths. He's responsible for why so many refugees are fleeing Syria, not exclusively, but he's the biggest contributor.
I'm sorry, you say that no one holds a candle to Assad. I'm going to have to disagree with you this year, because if you look at the media coverage of Syria over the past 4 years or so, Assad has been, a lot of responsibility is put on Assad. If you look at organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, a lot of responsibility lays with Assad. And then governments across the world from the start, Assad must go. So how can you say that responsibility isn't put on him when the majority of it, I think it's fair to say, is in fact put on him?
No, that's my point. If you look at who is responsible for the bulk of the war crimes, there are war crimes on all sides, but the vast majority of civilians killed have been due to the Assad government. Anybody who's been counting up the figures will say that. Anybody who looks at the facts will say that. So this is not a partisan position. This is just looking at the facts. Now, Human Rights Watch doesn't say, oh, Assad must go. We're saying Assad has to stop his war crime strategy.
So you're saying that Assad
targeting civilians.
is
and now that
worse
Russia is
than
there,
ISIS.
it has a duty to act as well.
You're saying that Assad...
I don't get into who's worse. They're both awful. They're both awful. Who has killed more civilians? Absolutely Assad. Who is worse? You can't say that. They're both terrible. They're both ripping up the most basic norms of international law. ISIS, through its beheadings, through its imposition of these severe restrictions on women and other people who were unfortunate enough to live under ISIS. Assad, by deliberately and indiscriminately targeting civilians who were unfortunate enough to live in areas held by the armed opposition. They are both behaving miserably. So don't get into a comparison game. They're both awful. And Russia has influence over Assad. It should be exercising that influence to get him to stop targeting Syrian civilians.
I'm not sure the Syrian people would agree with you. We do have to leave it there. So much appreciation, really, to you for coming on. Kenneth Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, thanks so much for being in the Now.